Fog clung to the hillside like something alive the night the Ridgewell cabin first appeared in the search reports. Most folks in Barrow County never hiked that deep into the woods. Everyone knew the mountain had a way of swallowing those who didn't belong to it. But Noah Brantley was too stubborn to fear old stories. He walked into the trees with a surveyor's map and a borrowed compass, confident he'd be back before dark. No one saw him return. In the days that followed, the mountain grew strangely quiet. Dogs refused to go near the tree-line. Hunters swore the usual chatter of birds had gone missing. And then came the first whisper, a distant, trembling sound carried on the cold air at night, like someone calling for help from under the earth. Those who heard it said the voice didn't sound human anymore. The Ridgewell sisters were the only ones who claimed not to hear it. They kept to themselves in their leaning wooden cabin, their windows always shuttered, their lanterns glowing through the cracks long past midnight. 3 women, all born within a year of each other, all pale as frost, all bound to the mountain in ways no outsider ever understood. People used to say the sisters practiced old ways, the kind buried with the earliest settlers, rituals whispered about in the same breath as curses. After Noah went missing, the rumors sharpened. A hiker swore he'd seen someone chained in their cellar. Another claimed the sisters dragged buckets of water and raw meat down the steps when they thought no one was watching. And always, that voice followed, echoing from beneath the Ridgewell place, steady as breath, patient as the earth. Some believed the sisters were hiding Noah. Others believed they were hiding something far worse. But one truth settled over the county heavier than the fog: whatever lay beneath that cabin had been waiting a long time, and Noah Brantley had stumbled right into its path. Noah Brantley's disappearance began as an ordinary delay, the kind locals blamed on bad weather, stubborn mud roads, or a curious surveyor wandering off his marked route. But the mountain had a long memory for the people it took, and those who lived closest to it felt the shift the moment Noah stepped across its boundary. He arrived with the easy confidence of someone who believed the wilderness always had a pattern, a logic, a traceable rhythm. He moved through the trees with his map folded under one arm, marking elevation points and creek paths as if the land were nothing more than terrain waiting to be catalogued. Yet the deeper he walked, the more the forest seemed to lean in around him, branches arching like ribs over a narrowing trail, the light dimming even though the sun still hung high above the canopy. Noah ignored the unease. He had been in woods before, he told himself. He had camped alone for weeks at a time. He knew the difference between a natural quiet and the kind born from watching eyes, but admitting that the silence bothered him would have meant turning back, and turning back was not something he did easily. The last man to see him, a fisherman returning from a creek on the west ridge, recalled Noah asking for directions. The sisters' land lay just beyond the hollow, he was told. Past the split oak, up the narrow rise, down toward the cabin with the rusted chimney. The fisherman warned him not to approach the place, not because of danger, he claimed, but because the women who lived there didn't take kindly to visitors. Noah laughed, thanked him, and walked straight toward the very property locals avoided even in daylight. Hours later, clouds rolled across the sky in a heavy, unnatural sweep, and the air shifted from cold to colder. Long after dark, thunder echoed from the valley though no rain fell, and by morning there was no sign of Noah's camp, no fresh tracks, not even disturbed soil where he had surveyed. When the search team finally entered the woods, they found odd details that didn't fit together. A boot print that stopped abruptly mid-step. A torn scrap of map caught in a thorn bush. A faint indentation near the Ridgewell fence line, as if someone had knelt there for a long time. Most unsettling of all was the sound several volunteers claimed to hear on the third night, a thin voice drifting up from somewhere deep beneath the trees, calling out in a slow, trembling rhythm, as though trying to speak through earth rather than air. The first rumors of the voices began with one man, a retired trapper who lived alone near the old service road. He was used to the sounds of the mountain, the low creaking of trees, the distant rush of water beneath limestone, the restless rustle of nocturnal creatures, but this sound was different. It began one night just after Noah disappeared, drifting through the darkness with a thin, wavering tone that didn't belong to any animal he knew. It was too steady, too intentional, like words struggling to form from a throat filled with soil. The trapper described it as a plea, stretched and warped as if the voice had traveled a long way underground before reaching his cabin. At first, he tried to ignore it, assuming it was wind slipping through a narrow pass. But then it grew louder, clearer, and every time it came, it seemed to originate from the direction of the Ridgewell property. Within days, others began reporting the same eerie sound. A woman hanging laundry at dusk heard it floating over the ridge, faint but desperate, as though someone were calling just beneath her feet. A school bus driver paused on the gravel road one morning, convinced she heard a low murmur rising from the drain pipe under the culvert. Children pointed toward the woods, whispering that the trees were talking again, though none dared repeat what they thought they heard. Even the sheriff, a man who rarely entertained superstition, admitted he felt an odd vibration in the ground during one of his patrols, as if something below the surface had shifted. The strangest part was not that people heard voices. In isolated communities, sound traveled unpredictably. What unsettled everyone was how the sisters reacted. When questioned, they dismissed the claims with offhand certainty, insisting the mountain produced odd echoes after storms, that underground streams carried sound in unnerving ways. But their calmness seemed rehearsed, too smooth, and the more they denied the voices, the more convinced people became that the sisters were the only ones who understood their origin. Their lanterns glowed later each night, their shadows pacing behind drawn curtains, their worn boots tracking fresh paths between the cellar door and the woods. As the nights grew colder, the voices grew sharper. Some listeners claimed they could make out a name, but each person insisted it was a different one, as though the voice changed depending on who heard it. Others said the tone held a warning, a fractured cry carried upward through layers of earth. And though no one could prove it, a quiet fear settled over the county, that whatever spoke in the dark was not calling to everyone, but calling to someone specific, someone trapped where no search party could reach. The discovery of the shack in the trees happened entirely by accident, a misstep by a hiker who had wandered off the main trail, drawn by the subtle glimmer of moonlight reflecting off something unnatural among the pines. The structure was small and crude, clearly not built for comfort, and yet it bore the careful attention of someone who had lived there for a time. Its walls were uneven planks, weathered gray and studded with nails driven at odd angles, giving the place a jagged, almost defensive quality. Around its perimeter, strange carvings marred the bark of surrounding trees, spirals and angular patterns that seemed to point toward the Ridgewell cabin deep in the woods. Most unsettling were the bones. Small, animal-like remnants were arranged in clusters, hung on cords, and pressed into the earth as if forming a silent grid. The hiker froze when he realized they were not all animals. Some were pieces of larger bones, human in shape, broken in ways that suggested ritual rather than decay. He had no desire to stay and examine the symbols, and the further he moved toward the cabin, the heavier the forest became, pressing in with shadows that seemed to shift in response to his every step. By the next morning, whispers of the shack spread through the county, though the hiker had said nothing at first, fearing ridicule. Those who finally saw it could hardly explain what compelled them to return. The carvings seemed to carry meaning only when approached at certain angles, and in the pale light of dawn, they appeared almost to move, as though the wood itself were alive with intent. Some locals speculated that the Ridgewell sisters were responsible, that the shack acted as an outer sentinel, warning trespassers before they even reached the main cabin. Others insisted the markings were far older, remnants of some obscure rite lost to memory, yet reawakened by the sisters' presence. Whatever the origin, the place radiated a tension that made the skin crawl, a pulse beneath the ground that hinted at unseen observers. Inside, the air was musty, sharp with the scent of decay, and the floor bore indentations of repeated footsteps, small but purposeful. Nothing stirred as the hiker crept closer to the back wall, yet the weight of watching eyes pressed down upon him, and he sensed he was not alone. One corner of the shack contained a shallow pit, lined with a thin layer of stones, each carved with the same angular symbols that adorned the trees. He felt a quiet dread as he imagined what might have been placed there before him, what might have been used to lure or punish, and for the first time, he understood the rumors he had dismissed, how the Ridgewells, if they were involved, were not merely secluded but actively engaged in something neither ordinary nor natural. By the time he fled, the moon had disappeared behind clouds, and the shadows swallowed the shack whole, leaving only the echo of footsteps that may not have been his own and the sense that the mountain itself had shifted, silently watching and waiting for the next person to stumble into its careful design. The first sighting of the bound cousin came from a neighbor who had long avoided the Ridgewell cabin, a man who usually kept to his fields and rarely spoke of the sisters. He claimed it happened one late afternoon while passing along the narrow ridge that led past the cabin's back entrance. The sun was low, casting long shadows that tangled with the skeletal trees, and he thought he saw movement near the cellar hatch, a pale hand slipping through the narrow gap between the rotting wooden slats. At first, he assumed it was a trick of light, a reflection on the faded boards, but the hand twitched and pulled at the air as though it were reaching for something, anything, beyond its confinement. The man froze, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and horror, and it was then he recognized the shape of the arm. Thin, pale, and trembling in a way that spoke of long hours spent in a confined, unnatural posture. It was unmistakably human. Panic rooted him in place, though his instinct screamed to run. The hand disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, slipping back into the darkness of the cellar, leaving the neighbor staring at nothing but shadowed wood. Yet he could not erase what he had seen, the faint impression of chains suggested by the way the fingers were bent, the tension in the wrist that spoke of restraint rather than choice. He returned home and tried to convince himself he had misinterpreted the scene, that fatigue or the angle of the sun had played tricks on him, but in his dreams, the image returned, pale fingers clawing at the thin air, a silent plea for attention that no one could answer. Word of the sighting spread slowly, first whispered among the neighbors who already spoke uneasily of the Ridgewell sisters, then carried further by those who had also begun to notice odd sounds and movement around the cabin. The idea that someone was imprisoned beneath the house, human and alive, sparked both fear and fascination. Locals debated whether the sisters were cruel and calculating, whether they held the cousin for some dark purpose, or whether they were protecting him from something far worse in the mountains. The ambiguity only deepened the dread, because no one could see inside the cellar without inviting scrutiny from the sisters, and the sisters themselves never ventured beyond their thresholds except at twilight, when the forest was already heavy with shadow. Investigators who later examined the cellar found signs of long-term habitation, the faint depression of a makeshift bedding, scuff marks on the dirt floor, and worn areas near the stone foundation where someone might have shuffled back and forth repeatedly. Yet no chains remained, no bindings were left visible, and the sisters claimed there was nothing in the cellar worth mentioning. This left the county with a chilling certainty: if a person had been there, confined and desperate, the Ridgewell sisters either controlled him completely, or whatever force kept him bound was far older, more deliberate, and far beyond the understanding of anyone who lived outside the shadows of that mountain. The forbidden ritual ledger was discovered entirely by accident, hidden in a crawlspace beneath the Ridgewell cabin, its presence unnoticed for decades until a storm tore a section of the floorboards loose. The ledger was small, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and fragile, filled with cramped, looping handwriting that almost seemed to writhe on the paper. Symbols unknown to anyone in the county were etched in margins, spirals and geometric patterns that gave the impression of movement, as though the book itself were trying to reach out to the reader. The contents were not immediately understandable, but what could be deciphered was chilling. The sisters had meticulously documented rituals tied to their bloodline, rites that required precise timing, specific materials, and, most disturbing of all, a human presence described as the anchor, whose role was essential to completing the ceremonies. Mentions of the cousin's name appeared repeatedly, written in varying degrees of urgency, often alongside warnings about failure and consequences that were left deliberately vague, yet unmistakably severe. The ledger revealed a belief system that predated even the oldest settlers of the region, suggesting that the Ridgewell sisters had inherited more than just the land. They had inherited a legacy of practices steeped in secrecy and devotion to something that might no longer be entirely human. Passages spoke of the mountain itself as a living entity, responsive to the rituals performed within its shadows, and implied that the anchor must be present for certain energies to be released or contained. The writing oscillated between meticulous instructions and frantic warnings, creating a sense that the authors were both in control of, and terrified by, what they were doing. Lines detailing the timing of movements, the positioning of objects, and the precise nature of offerings implied that failure was not merely symbolic, but tangible, capable of producing catastrophic results not just for the sisters, but for anyone within reach of the mountain's influence. What disturbed investigators most was the ledger's insistence on secrecy, emphasizing that outsiders must never witness the rituals, and that the anchor could not speak or be freed until the ceremonies were complete. It suggested a dynamic of absolute control, the cousin not just as a participant, but as a linchpin without which the balance of the ritual, and perhaps the mountain itself, would falter. Marginal notes written in a different hand hinted at previous attempts that had gone wrong, leaving marks of violence or failure that the sisters had carefully erased from memory but recorded meticulously in this hidden book. The presence of this ledger transformed the Ridgewell sisters from mere eccentric hermits into figures of deliberate purpose, their isolation no longer a quirk but a necessity, their actions a calculated engagement with powers and forces that the townsfolk could scarcely comprehend, and whose consequences were only beginning to reach out from the shadows of the cabin and the hidden depths of the mountain beneath it. The discovery of the cellar's second door came during one of the early searches of the Ridgewell property, when a volunteer tripped over what appeared to be a section of uneven floorboards near the back of the cabin. At first glance, it looked like an old storage hatch, neglected and rotting, but as the boards were lifted, a narrow passage revealed itself, carved directly into the living rock beneath the house. The air that escaped was damp and earthy, carrying a faint metallic tang, as though the mountain itself exhaled centuries of contained secrets. The passage was barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through, and the walls bore the unmistakable markings of human hands, scratches, grooves, and symbols etched deep into the stone, patterns that mirrored some of the designs found in the ledger and on the trees surrounding the property. The faint echo of dripping water suggested the presence of a subterranean stream, though no natural spring had been mapped in the area, and the darkness swallowed all sense of scale, making the space feel impossibly deep. Volunteers dared not venture far, claiming the air grew heavier the further they moved, pressing on their lungs, as if the mountain itself resented intrusion. Word of the hidden chamber spread quickly, and with it, a growing unease. The idea that the Ridgewell sisters had a secret beneath their cellar confirmed the worst suspicions of the locals, that the cousin was not simply confined, but deliberately kept in a space both hidden and inhospitable, carved by unknown hands for unknown purposes. Some speculated that the chamber was older than the cabin itself, remnants of an earlier, forgotten era when rituals and offerings were conducted far from prying eyes. Others believed that the sisters had discovered the hollow and shaped it further, reinforcing it over time to suit their own purposes, the stone walls absorbing centuries of secrecy and fear until they became almost sentient in their silence. Inside, the chamber was narrow, suffocating, and strangely geometrical, as if its dimensions had been dictated by precise calculations or arcane knowledge. Marks in the rock suggested repeated movement along certain paths, almost like tracks worn by a person forced to pace or kneel over and over. The air carried the faintest traces of smoke, perhaps from candles or torches long extinguished, but also something else, a subtle, musky odor that hinted at human presence. Every step produced echoes that seemed unnaturally quick, bouncing not just off stone but off some hidden void beyond the visible walls. The volunteers felt watched, though no one could see anything beyond the reach of their lamps. It was as if the mountain itself were alive, its heartbeat embedded in the stone, waiting for someone to make the wrong step, to awaken what had been sealed for decades beneath the Ridgewell cabin, and ensuring that anyone who entered felt the pressure of eyes that were not human, waiting silently in the darkness that stretched downward, ever downward, into the heart of the mountain. The night the forest went silent arrived without warning, a sudden and unnatural stillness that swallowed the ridge and the hollow below the Ridgewell cabin. The usual chorus of night creatures, crickets, owls, foxes, vanished as if struck mute, leaving an oppressive quiet that pressed on the chest of anyone daring to step into the woods. Hunters returning from late trips found their dogs refusing to move beyond the tree-line, whimpering or cowering, ears flattened, eyes wide with unease. Even the wind, which normally carried through the pines with a mournful sigh, seemed to stall, leaving the branches trembling without sound. It was a night that unsettled everyone who noticed, for the absence of ordinary life felt deliberate, as though the mountain itself had drawn a breath and held it, waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. Those in the valley who lived closest to the Ridgewell cabin reported strange phenomena at the same time. Lanterns flickered despite being filled with oil, and faint shadows moved along walls inside homes, though no one was there. A father returning from the general store swore he heard soft scraping noises beneath the floorboards, accompanied by a whisper that rose and fell in rhythm with his heartbeat. The sisters' cabin, which normally remained dark and silent after dusk, glowed faintly, a warm amber seeping through cracks in the shutters, yet no smoke or scent of fire could be detected. People whispered that the sisters themselves were moving unusually, pacing in patterns that seemed ritualistic, their lanterns swinging in deliberate arcs, their faces pale and fixed as if focused on something beneath the house that demanded attention. The air carried an almost tangible tension, heavy and electric, that made every step toward the cabin feel like stepping into another world. Searchers who ventured closer that night found more than silence. Tracks of animals stopped abruptly, flattened into the dirt, as though they had been frozen mid-step. The distant river's usual babble seemed to halt, the surface glassy and unmoving under the pale moonlight. Those brave enough to approach the Ridgewell property reported hearing faint murmurs echoing from the cellar, uneven and shifting in tone, like voices calling to one another in a language that was only partially human. Even without seeing him, it was clear that Noah's presence, or the absence of it, was being marked, measured, or perhaps tested. It was a night that etched itself into memory, the kind that could not be dismissed as coincidence or superstition. In the hours before dawn, the air seemed to thrum with anticipation, carrying the unmistakable impression that something beneath the cabin had awakened, that the mountain had finally turned its gaze from indifference to intent, and that whatever waited in the shadows of the Ridgewell cellar was no longer content to remain unseen or unheard. When Noah finally found the courage, or perhaps the desperation, to speak, his words were nothing more than a tremulous whisper, barely audible over the persistent drip of water from the stone walls. He had been trapped in the hidden chamber beneath the Ridgewell cabin for days, perhaps weeks, and the weight of confinement had worn his voice thin, fragile, almost unrecognizable. His eyes, wide and haunted, darted constantly to the shadows, as though expecting them to move against him, and every sound in the chamber made him flinch. The first thing he revealed was not what he had endured, but what he had seen, the sisters moving through the cellar above, performing actions that followed patterns drawn in the ledger, their hands tracing lines and symbols that Noah could now understand were not merely decorative, but functional, capable of manipulating some unseen force. He spoke of a presence in the darkness that did not belong to any living creature he had known, something patient, aware of him, watching every moment of his confinement. Noah's warning was simple in words but impossible in its implications. He described the sisters' ritual as a process meant to awaken or release a force imprisoned beneath the mountain, a force that had lain dormant for generations but now stirred because of their actions. He could hear it in the walls of the chamber, a low vibration that seemed to grow stronger whenever the sisters moved above, a resonance that penetrated the stone and pressed against his chest. The air carried a hum, subtle at first, then rising into a tone that seemed almost like a voice, though it could not speak any language he recognized. Noah insisted it was intelligent, deliberate, and hungry in a way that was not physical but existential, something that could not be reasoned with or restrained by human hands alone. He trembled as he explained that if the rituals continued to their conclusion, the force would break free, and the consequences would extend far beyond the Ridgewell cabin. He also revealed the dynamic between himself and the sisters, describing the way they watched him, measured him, and treated him as more than a prisoner, as a necessary element, an essential component without which their rituals could not succeed. Their patience was infinite, their cruelty restrained by purpose rather than impulse. Noah understood now that he was not merely captive, but indispensable, the linchpin that allowed the balance of the hidden energies to remain intact. If he attempted to escape or resist, the sisters' actions would become even more deliberate, ensuring the force beneath the mountain was disturbed in ways no human could contain. Every word he spoke carried the tremor of fear, but also of certainty, that the Ridgewell sisters were not acting out of malice alone, but in obedience to something far older, far more deliberate than anyone outside the forest could imagine, and that by the time anyone could intervene, the consequences might already be unfolding unseen, deep beneath the earth where shadows moved with intent and voices whispered promises of awakening. The breaking of the seal occurred on a night when the mountain seemed alive with anticipation, a storm rolling over the ridge with winds that rattled the cabin's shutters and lightning that illuminated the hollow in stark, fleeting bursts. The air smelled of wet stone and ozone, heavy with the tension of forces long contained beneath the Ridgewell property. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, a low rumble vibrating through the floorboards of the cabin, echoing into the forest like the heartbeat of something immense lying just beyond reach. The cellar door, long bolted and chained, shuddered against its hinges, responding to the pressure from below. The sisters moved about calmly above, carrying lanterns, murmuring words that had been written in the ledger, their faces pale and fixed, as if they were channeling something older than themselves. But the moment the door creaked, the voices below changed. The faint, trembling calls that had haunted the county for weeks became guttural, urgent, and layered, as if multiple entities were speaking at once, speaking in tones that no human throat could produce. The mountain trembled in response, subtly at first, then violently. Trees bent and snapped in the wind, sending a rain of branches down the slopes, while the earth seemed to hum in resonance with the chamber beneath the cabin. Observers who dared approach described an overwhelming sensation of being watched, of something immense shifting behind the stone walls. A chill swept over the hollow that was not born of wind or rain, and those nearby reported hearing a deep, guttural voice that did not belong to the sisters, nor to Noah, nor to any animal. It reverberated through the soil, moving upward like water pressed through cracks in rock, carrying words that were not words, but meaning nonetheless, a warning, a demand, an acknowledgement of freedom. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, the silence of animals amplifying the unnatural chorus rising from beneath the cabin, creating a crescendo of sound and vibration that left even the most skeptical witnesses shaken to their core. Noah, finally freed from his hidden prison, stumbled from the chamber, his limbs weak, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. He whispered that the presence beneath the stone had awakened, that it had recognized him as the anchor the sisters had described, and that it would not remain contained for long. The sisters remained above, their ritual completed, yet even they seemed to sense the shift, their expressions betraying awe and fear in equal measure. The cellar door swung fully open on its own, groaning against the force pressing upward, and the hidden depths revealed nothing visible, only the echoing resonance of the entity now unbound. Every observer felt the mountain itself pulse beneath their feet, a reminder that whatever lay beneath the Ridgewell cabin had been patient for generations, and that its awakening had consequences far beyond any human understanding, extending outward into the forest, the valley, and the dark corners of the night where it had waited silently for so long.